My name is Keelan Vance. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in places where people speak very confidently about things they only partially understand. Corporate strategy meetings, product launches, late-night Slack threads where someone decides a direction before anyone has time to think. If you had met me during those years, you probably wouldn't have remembered much about me. That wasn't an accident. I've always had a voice that sits somewhere between calm and quiet. Not timid, just measured. The kind of voice that people sometimes mistake for uncertainty. I'm also the person who usually sat slightly back from the table, notebook open, listening longer than most people felt comfortable with. To some colleagues, that made me the reliable one. To others, I was support staff energy, even when the org chart said otherwise. And to a few people, though they never said it out loud, I was someone easy to schedule over, talk past, or quietly assign the work nobody wanted credit for. The strange thing is, I didn't resent it at first. Because when you grow up learning that attention is expensive and silence is free, you develop a habit of watching. You notice patterns. You hear the parts of conversations people think no one is recording. Most of the time, that kind of observation just makes you good at your job. But every once in a while, it lets you see something earlier than everyone else. The story I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge. There's no dramatic confrontation, no shouting in a conference room, no triumphant moment where someone finally realizes they underestimated the quiet woman at the table. Real life doesn't usually work that way. Instead, this is a story about something much slower, a gradual shift in how people treat you, and the moment when you quietly decide that you're no longer going to hold the system together for them. It begins on a completely ordinary Friday afternoon. At 4:58 p.m., just 2 minutes before most people start pretending to wrap up their work for the week, my calendar suddenly filled with weekend meetings. One after another, 3 notifications, 3 separate invites. What was strange wasn't the timing. In some companies, weekend meetings happen. What was strange was this. The invites came from 3 different managers at once. None of them seemed to realize the others had scheduled the same time. And in that small overlapping square on my calendar, something became very clear about the role everyone thought I played. I didn't react immediately, I just watched the notifications settle into place. Because sometimes the most important moment in a story isn't when something happens. It's the moment when you finally understand what it means. So before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly realized people saw you very differently from how you saw yourself? If you had asked people in my office to describe me back then, most of them would have used the same word, reliable. It's the kind of compliment that sounds positive until you hear it enough times to understand what people really mean. Reliable meant I was the one who responded to messages even when they came in at 9:30 on a Friday night. Reliable meant that if a presentation was missing numbers an hour before a meeting, someone would quietly send it to me with the phrase, "You're better with this stuff than I am." Reliable meant I knew how to fix problems without making the person who caused them look incompetent. In a company growing as fast as ours was, that skill made me useful. But usefulness and visibility are not the same thing. The company itself wasn't small anymore. We had passed the stage where everyone knew everyone else. Departments had layers, titles had qualifiers, associate, senior, lead, director. Strategy meetings began involving more people than the conference rooms were designed to hold. And somewhere in that expansion, a quiet pattern had formed. The loudest people became decision makers, the fastest talkers became the perceived experts, and the people who kept everything actually functioning slowly disappeared into the background. I was one of those people. Not because I lacked opinions, I had plenty, but because I had learned early in my career that timing mattered more than volume. Interrupting someone mid-idea rarely changed their mind. Letting them finish usually revealed the flaw in their own reasoning, so I listened. And while other people filled the air with certainty, I filled my notebook. Names, decisions, dates, not in a suspicious way, just a habit. When a budget approval shifted from one department to another, I wrote it down. When someone promised a deliverable that depended on 3 other teams cooperating, I wrote that down too. Patterns eventually appear if you watch long enough. But to most of my coworkers, the notebook probably just looked like a personality quirk. Keelan writes things down. Keelan stays late sometimes. Keelan will figure it out. That was the story people told themselves about me. There were three managers in particular who seemed to rely on that story the most. Martin Cole, head of product partnerships, charismatic in meetings, chronically late to everything else. Dana Whitaker, operations director, extremely efficient, especially when it came to assigning work to people who rarely said no. And Lewis Grant, who managed strategic initiatives but had a tendency to treat shared resources as if they were personal assistants. None of them were villains. That's important to understand. They weren't cruel people. They weren't cartoonishly arrogant executives who stomped around demanding obedience. In fact, if you met them individually, you might even like them. The problem wasn't malice. The problem was an assumption. Over time, each of them had quietly come to believe the same thing about me. If something needed to be handled, Keelan would handle it, even if nobody explicitly asked, even if 3 different people expected it at the same time. And for a long while, they were right. Because saying nothing is easy when you're good at solving problems. But silence has an interesting side effect. People begin to mistake it for agreement. And eventually they forget they were ever asking. That's the version of me they knew. The quiet one. The dependable one. The person who would always make things work somehow. What they didn't realize was that reliability has a limit. And sometimes the moment you reach it doesn't look dramatic at all. Sometimes it looks like a completely ordinary Friday afternoon, when 3 meeting notifications appear at the exact same time. And you realize something very simple. No one had actually checked whether you were available. The strange thing about moments that eventually change everything is that, at the time, they rarely feel important. They feel small, almost too small to justify reacting to. The first time I remember noticing it clearly was about 8 months before that Friday afternoon. We were in one of the smaller conference rooms, glass walls, whiteboard already half filled with diagrams from a previous meeting. The kind of room where every conversation feels slightly performative because anyone walking past can see you gesturing at the board. Martin was leading the meeting. He had a natural way of doing that, even when the meeting technically belonged to someone else. Confident posture, quick pacing, the kind of energy that makes people assume momentum equals correctness. We were discussing a partnership rollout timeline. 5 teams are involved, 3 launch phases, a budget that had already changed twice. As usual, I had spent the morning mapping dependencies, which teams needed approvals first, where delays were most likely to happen, and which part of the timeline looked optimistic in a way that might later become embarrassing. About halfway through the discussion, Martin turned toward the whiteboard and circled one of the dates. "This should be fine," he said. 2 weeks is plenty of time for operations. Across the table, Dana nodded without really looking up from her laptop. Most people in the room accepted that statement instantly, but the diagram in my notebook told a slightly different story. Operations couldn't start until legal finished their review. Legal was already backlogged, and the compliance check required a data set that Lewis's team hadn't even finalized yet. In other words, 2 weeks wasn't just optimistic, it was impossible. I waited a moment, letting the room settle. Then I spoke, the way I usually did, calmly, without interrupting anyone mid-sentence. "Actually, that's all," I said. "Legal review alone usually takes 10 business days, and operations can't begin until that's finished. So realistically, we're probably looking at closer to 4 weeks. It wasn't criticism, just a correction." Martin paused for a second, marker still in his hand. Then he smiled in that easy, reassuring way people use when they want to keep the conversation moving. "Right," he said. "But that's the normal timeline." He tapped the date again on the board. "This one's important, so we'll move faster." A few people around the table chuckled lightly, the way groups sometimes do when confidence replaces evidence. I didn't argue, not because I thought he was right, but because I had already learned something about meetings like this. Once the room collectively agrees to believe a timeline, facts rarely change it. So I just wrote the date down in my notebook, circled it once. Across from me, Dana finally glanced up. "Keelan," she said, "you'll coordinate the cross-team pieces, right?" It wasn't phrased as a question, more like a logistical assumption. "Sure," I said. And that was it. The meeting moved on. Someone erased part of the whiteboard. A new topic replaced the old one. By the end of the hour, no one seemed to remember that the timeline had ever been questioned. Except me, because that's the thing about small moments of dismissal. Individually, they're harmless. No raised voices, no direct disrespect. Just a quiet signal that your input doesn't quite alter the trajectory. But something interesting happens when you notice them often enough. You start realizing they're not random. They follow a pattern. And once you see a pattern, it becomes very hard to unsee it. Back then, though, I didn't think of it as the beginning of anything. I just thought of it as another note in a notebook that was slowly filling with observations. What I didn't realize yet was that the notebook wasn't just documenting work. It was documenting something else. A shift in how people had started treating my voice. And that meeting, while small as it seemed, was probably the first time I felt the edge of it. Just a small cut. Barely visible, but the kind you remember later. After that meeting with Martin, nothing dramatic happened. The timeline slipped exactly the way I had expected. Legal took 11 business days instead of 10. Compliance discovered a dataset mismatch that took another week to correct. By the time operations actually began their part, the launch date had quietly shifted almost a month. No one mentioned the earlier conversation. Not in the meeting recap, not in the follow-up emails, not even casually in the hallway. In fast-moving companies, memory tends to be short. People rarely revisit the moment a decision was made. They only deal with the consequences once they appear. So the schedule changed, the project moved forward, and everyone treated it as a normal adjustment. Except something had changed in a subtler way. After that meeting, I began noticing how often similar moments happened. Not identical ones, just variations of the same pattern. Someone would ask for input. I would offer a perspective, usually based on logistics or data. The room would acknowledge it briefly, then the conversation would continue in the direction it had already been going. It was rarely intentional. That's what made it easy to rationalize. Martin was just enthusiastic. Dana was managing too many teams at once. Lewis liked decisive answers and sometimes moved past details too quickly. None of those traits was unusual, and to be fair, sometimes they were even useful. Momentum can push projects forward when endless analysis might stall them. So whenever something like that happened, I told myself the same thing. This isn't personal. Maybe they just needed to hear the idea again later. Maybe timing mattered. Maybe I hadn't explained it clearly enough. Quiet people are very good at creating explanations for other people's behavior. It keeps the workplace comfortable, it keeps the meetings efficient, and it keeps the peace. Over time, though, another small shift occurred. Because once a group grows accustomed to someone staying calm, no matter what happens, they begin relying on that calm. Tasks started appearing in my inbox that technically belonged to other teams. Keelan, could you take a quick look at this? Keelan, you're great at untangling these timelines. Keelan, can you just coordinate everyone for a minute? The word quick appeared often. Quick look, quick adjustment, quick coordination, but quick tasks accumulate quietly. A spreadsheet here, a follow-up call there, a late evening reconciling numbers that didn't quite align. None of it looked like a major responsibility on its own. Yet somehow I kept finding myself at the center of projects I hadn't officially been assigned to. And because I didn't complain about it, the arrangement felt natural to everyone else. There's a particular role that exists in many workplaces. It doesn't appear on organizational charts, but everyone recognizes it once it forms. The stabilizer, the person who absorbs friction so other people don't have to feel it. If communication breaks down between departments, the stabilizer quietly reconnects it. If timelines start drifting, the stabilizer adjusts them. If something complicated needs to be explained calmly, the stabilizer does the explaining. For a long time, I accepted that role without really thinking about it, partly because I was good at it, partly because helping people solve problems feels satisfying, and partly because I assumed something important, that eventually the value of that role would be visible, that eventually someone would say, we should probably make sure Keelan is actually involved when decisions are made. But that moment never arrived. Instead, something else happened. The more dependable I proved myself to be, the more invisible the effort behind it became. Problems simply stopped appearing for other people, which meant they also stopped noticing who had prevented them. Looking back now, I realized that was the stage when the pattern fully normalized. Not open disrespect, just quiet expectation. Keelan will handle it. Keelan always does. And as long as I kept accepting that logic, nothing had any reason to change. At least, not until that Friday afternoon when my calendar filled with 3 meetings scheduled for the exact same time. Because in that moment, the stabilizer role suddenly revealed something unexpected. Not just how much people relied on me, but how little they actually checked before doing it. There's a moment in most long-running work environments when an invisible role becomes permanent. No announcement, no meeting about it, just a quiet collective understanding. By the time I realized what role I had been assigned, everyone else had already been operating under that assumption for months, maybe longer. It happened gradually enough that I almost missed it. In the beginning, when someone asked for help coordinating a project, it felt collaborative. We were solving problems together, teams overlapping, timelines shifting, priorities changing every week. But eventually, I noticed something subtle in the language people used with me. Not, "Can you help with this?" More like, "Keelan, we'll need you to make sure this stays on track." Or, "Just loop Keelan in and she'll sort out the moving pieces." Sometimes I wasn't even included in the conversation itself. Someone would simply mention my name as the solution to a logistical problem. And strangely enough, the people saying these things weren't wrong. If I saw a broken process, I fixed it. If two teams misunderstood each other, I clarified it. If a timeline didn't make sense, I quietly rebuilt it in a way that would. That was the paradox. The better I became at smoothing things out, the less anyone had to confront the friction that existed in the first place. And when friction disappears, so does the recognition that someone removed it. The three managers who relied on me the most, Martin, Dana, and Lewis, each used that invisible role in slightly different ways. Martin liked momentum. His meetings often produced ambitious ideas faster than the company could realistically execute them. When those ideas collided with logistical reality, I would usually be the one adjusting the timeline so it could actually function. Dana was more operationally precise, but she also managed a massive workload. Whenever a project crossed departmental lines and became messy, she would gently redirect it toward me with the quiet confidence that I would keep it organized. Lewis, on the other hand, treated complexity like something that should simply resolve itself. If three teams disagreed about a process, Lewis's instinct wasn't to mediate. It was to move forward and trust that someone else would make the pieces fit later. More often than not, that someone became me. None of them said this out loud, but collectively, they had formed a quiet expectation. Keelan would stabilize whatever became unstable. Over time, that expectation shaped how they scheduled work. If a meeting involved multiple departments, I was included. If a timeline looked uncertain, I was copied on the email. If something urgent appeared late on a Friday afternoon, it usually ended up in my inbox. The strange thing is that I didn't resent this immediately. There's a certain satisfaction in being the person people trust to solve difficult problems. But trust can slowly blur into assumption, and assumption can eventually erase boundaries. I began noticing that people rarely asked whether I had capacity. They simply assumed I would find a way to make room. If something conflicted with another commitment, the unspoken logic seemed to be that I would rearrange my time to accommodate it. After all, I always had before. That's why the moment on that Friday afternoon stood out so sharply, not because weekend meetings were unusual, but because three different managers, Martin, Dana, and Lewis, had scheduled meetings with me at exactly the same time. Not sequentially, not spaced apart, the same hour. And the strangest part was this: none of them had checked with me first. None of them had noticed the other invitations. It was as if each of them had independently reached the same conclusion. Keelan will make it work. When I looked at the calendar grid, 3 colored blocks stacked perfectly on top of one another, I realized something very simple. The role I had been assigned didn't include the possibility that I might not be available, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't immediately start rearranging my schedule to fix it. Instead, I just sat there and looked at the screen, because something inside me had shifted, quietly but completely. When the 3 meeting notifications appeared on my calendar that Friday afternoon, my first instinct was automatic. Open the scheduling panel, move one meeting earlier, push another one to Sunday morning, send a polite message explaining the adjustment. That had always been the pattern. If a conflict appeared, I resolved it. But this time, my hand stopped on the mouse. The screen glowed quietly in front of me, the calendar grid showing 3 overlapping blocks like stacked cards. Each one had a different color: Martin's team in blue, Dana's in green, Lewis's in orange. 3 separate conversations, 3 separate expectations. And somehow, all of them had landed on the exact same hour. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The office had already begun its slow Friday evening transformation. A few people were packing laptops into backpacks. Someone down the hall laughed at something on their phone. The faint hum of the building's ventilation system filled the background. It was an ordinary moment, but for some reason, instead of fixing the problem immediately, I opened the details of each invitation. Martin's meeting, quick alignment before Monday partner call, Dana's meeting, Operation Sync, need Keelan's input. Lewis's meeting, strategy checkpoint, should be brief. 3 different purposes, 3 different priorities. Yet each one had assumed the same thing, that my time on Saturday afternoon belonged to them. Individually, none of those requests was unreasonable. That was the subtle brilliance of the system I had unknowingly helped build. No single demand crossed a line, but when you stacked them together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. For the first time, I wondered something I hadn't seriously asked myself before. What would happen if I didn't solve this? Not in a dramatic way, not with a protest or a complaint, just by doing nothing. The thought felt strangely unfamiliar. For years, my instinct had been to remove friction wherever I found it. If a schedule didn't work, I corrected it. If people misunderstood each other, I clarified things. But this conflict wasn't an accident caused by scheduling software. It was the result of 3 different people assuming the same invisible rule. Keelan will adjust. I looked again at the overlapping blocks. Then I opened my notebook. The leather cover was worn smooth at the edges from years of being carried between meetings. Inside, pages were filled with small handwriting, dates, timelines, diagrams connecting different teams and decisions. I flipped to a blank page. At the top, I wrote the date. Then underneath it, I wrote 3 names: Martin, Dana, Lewis. And next to each name, I wrote the exact time of their meeting invitation. The act of writing it down did something interesting. It slowed the moment. Instead of reacting instinctively, I found myself observing the situation almost the way I would observe a business process. Inputs, assumptions, outcomes. If I rearranged the schedule, the system would continue exactly as it had before. Everyone would get what they needed. No one would notice anything unusual. But if I didn't rearrange it, something else would happen. Not chaos, just visibility, because eventually each of them would realize the same thing. They had scheduled the same person at the same time. And for the first time in years, it wouldn't be my responsibility to quietly solve that puzzle before anyone else noticed. The realization didn't feel angry. It felt calm, almost analytical, like watching a system reveal its own structure. I closed the notebook. The 3 meeting invitations still sat there on my screen, unchanged. And for the first time since I had started working at that company, I did something that felt strangely radical. I left them exactly where they were. No adjustments, no explanations, just silence. Because sometimes the most powerful shift in a pattern isn't confrontation. It's simply choosing not to maintain it anymore. For most of my career, silence had been a habit, something I slipped into naturally during meetings when conversations moved too quickly to be productive. Something I used while observing how decisions were formed before offering an opinion. But after that Friday afternoon, silence became something different. It became a choice. When I shut down my computer that evening, the 3 overlapping meeting invitations were still sitting on my calendar exactly where they had landed. No rescheduling. No polite note asking someone to adjust the time. Just 3 colored blocks quietly occupy the same hour. Walking out of the building, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not relief, not rebellion, just a quiet curiosity about what would happen next. Because up until that moment, I had always been the invisible hinge that allowed conflicting expectations to function without friction. Now, for the first time, I had stepped away from that role. Saturday morning arrived slowly. I woke up at my usual time, made coffee, and opened my laptop. Not because I had to, but because habits built over years rarely disappear overnight. Emails were already trickling in, a few status updates, a Slack thread discussing next week's priorities. Nothing unusual. The meeting invitations were still there. No one had noticed the conflict yet. At around 11:20 a.m., the first message appeared. It was from Lewis. A short Slack notification popped up on my screen. "Hey Keelan, looking forward to our quick strategy checkpoint later." I stared at the message for a moment. Normally, I would have replied immediately with something like, "Just a heads up, I have another meeting at that time. Would you mind shifting it 30 minutes? But this time, I simply acknowledged the message with a quick reaction emoji and nothing else. A small response, Polite but non-committal. About 40 minutes later, another notification appeared. This one from Dana. Quick note, we'll keep the operations sync tight today. Shouldn't take long. Again, I read it carefully. Again, I didn't mention the overlap. And then, just after noon, the third message arrived. Martin, as usual, was the most casual about it. Hey, Keelan, appreciate you jumping on tomorrow's partner prep. Should be easy. 3 separate messages, 3 separate expectations. None of them was aware of the others. If someone had looked at the situation from the outside, my silence might have seemed passive, maybe even avoidant. But internally, something very deliberate was happening. I was observing, not the meetings themselves, but the assumptions surrounding them. For years, my role had been to detect problems before anyone else encountered them. This time, I was allowing the system to reach the point where the problem became visible on its own. The difference may sound small, but psychologically, it was enormous. Because the stabilizer role only works when the stabilizer keeps absorbing tension. The moment that person steps back, the tension has to go somewhere else. Around 1:45 p.m., about 15 minutes before the overlapping meeting time, I opened my calendar again. 3 invitations. Same hour, same quiet assumption. I didn't cancel anything. I didn't move anything. Instead, I did something even simpler. I chose one. Dana's operations sync had the most direct impact on active timelines, so I clicked the join button when the meeting began. The other 2 meetings, they started without me. For the first time in years, I allowed 2 expectations to collide without stepping in between them. And I knew something interesting was about to happen, because silence, when used deliberately, doesn't hide problems. It reveals them. The operations meeting with Dana lasted 23 minutes. It was efficient, focused, and almost completely routine. We discussed 2 pending deliverables, clarified a compliance requirement, and adjusted a minor scheduling detail for the following week. At no point did anyone mention the fact that I had been expected in 2 other meetings at the exact same time. When the call ended, I closed the meeting window and sat quietly for a moment. Then I opened Slack. 2 unread messages were waiting. The first was from Martin. Hey, I think we might have lost you. Everything okay? The second came from Lewis a few minutes later. Did the strategy call get moved? I didn't see you join. Neither message sounded irritated, just confused, which made sense. Up until that moment, the idea that I might simply not appear somewhere I was expected had never really occurred to them. For years, I had quietly ensured that expectation was always met. Now, for the first time, the system had produced an unexpected result. I replied to both messages calmly. To Martin, I wrote, "Looks like there was a scheduling overlap with another meeting. Happy to review notes or connect later this week. Bad." To Lewis, "I had a conflicting call scheduled at the same time. Let me know if there's anything specific you'd like me to look at." Both responses were polite, neutral, no blame, no explanation beyond the obvious. And within a few minutes, both of them responded with some variation of the same realization. They hadn't noticed the conflict. Not when they scheduled the meetings, not when they sent reminders, not even when the meeting actually started. For the first time in a long while, the invisible coordination I normally provided had simply not happened. And suddenly everyone could see the gap. But the interesting part wasn't their confusion. The interesting part was what happened inside my own thinking over the next few days. Because once I had stepped back from constantly fixing things, I began noticing something I had overlooked before. How much of the company's operational stability actually depended on invisible work. Work that wasn't assigned. Work that wasn't documented. Work that simply happened because certain people like me, quietly ensured it did. That realization changed the way I looked at my notebook. For years, it had been a personal habit, a place where I wrote down timelines, dependencies, decisions, and small inconsistencies that might later matter. Now I began reading those pages with a slightly different perspective. Instead of just documenting projects, the notes revealed patterns. Who actually resolved problems when deadlines slipped? Who made commitments that depended on work they didn't directly oversee? Who quietly adjusted processes so other teams could continue moving forward? The patterns weren't dramatic, but they were extremely consistent. And in many cases, they pointed back to the same quiet center of gravity. Not just me, but a small group of people across different departments who had developed the same instinct. Observe first, fix quietly, avoid unnecessary conflict. Individually, none of us was senior enough to control the strategy. But collectively, we were often the ones ensuring the strategy actually functioned in reality. What surprised me most was how rarely anyone above us seemed aware of that dynamic. From their perspective, the company simply ran. Projects launched, deadlines adjusted, teams collaborated. But they rarely saw the invisible threads connecting all those outcomes. Because those threads were maintained quietly, often by people who didn't feel the need to announce it. For the first time, I began wondering something slightly uncomfortable. What would the system look like if those threads weren't constantly maintained? Not through sabotage, not through anger, just through absence. Through the simple decision to stop solving problems that technically belong to someone else. It wasn't a dramatic thought. In fact, it felt almost clinical, like observing the structural supports inside a building. You rarely notice them when everything is stable, but if enough of them quietly disappear, the architecture begins revealing stresses that were always there. Over the next week, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse anyone of undervaluing the work I had been doing. Instead, I continued observing and documenting. Because something had become very clear to me. The real leverage in most systems doesn't come from power or authority. It comes from understanding how the system actually works. And for the first time, I realized I might understand that structure better than most of the people making decisions about it. The realization didn't arrive as a dramatic discovery. There was no secret file, no confidential document that suddenly revealed everything. Instead, it emerged gradually as I began revisiting the notes I had been collecting for years. My notebook had never been intended as evidence. It was simply a habit, something I started early in my career because writing things down helped me see patterns that were easy to miss in fast-moving conversations. But once I began reviewing those pages with fresh eyes, the structure of the company began revealing itself in ways I hadn't fully appreciated before. Decisions were rarely made in isolation. A partnership announcement depended on legal approvals. Legal approvals depended on compliance reviews. Compliance reviews depended on data sets from analytics teams. Every step relied on another. That much was obvious. What wasn't obvious, at least not until you mapped it carefully, was who actually kept those steps connected when things went wrong. Because things always went wrong. Deadlines slipped. Teams misunderstood requirements. Data arrived incomplete. And every time that happened, someone had to quietly step in to prevent the entire process from stalling. The strange thing was how rarely that role appeared in official documentation. The project plans listed deliverables, the org chart listed departments, but the actual flow of problem-solving happened somewhere between those two structures. And as I traced that flow across my notes, a quiet pattern emerged. Again and again, the same names appeared beside the moments when problems had been resolved. Not always as the official owner of the task. Often just the person who noticed the issue and connected the right people before it escalated. My own name appeared frequently. That part wasn't surprising. But what caught my attention were the other names that appeared just as consistently. People in operations, someone in analytics, a program coordinator from the partnerships team. None of us held particularly powerful titles. Yet the notes showed that many of the company's most complex projects had only succeeded because someone like us had quietly reassembled the moving parts when they drifted apart. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply how systems stabilize themselves. Invisible work accumulates around the people willing to do it. What made the realization interesting was something else I noticed. Whenever a project succeeded, the recognition usually flowed upward. Directors presented results. Managers summarized achievements. Strategy leaders described the outcome during executive updates, which made perfect sense from a hierarchical perspective. But it also meant that the operational memory of how those successes actually happened often lived somewhere else. In conversations, in private notes, in the quiet mental maps held by people who had been watching the process unfold in real time. That's when something clicked for me, not emotionally, structurally. For years, I had assumed my role in the system was simply supportive, helpful, but ultimately replaceable. But the notebook suggested something slightly different. It suggested that the people doing this invisible coordination had become a kind of informal infrastructure, not because we were officially assigned that role, but because we had gradually accumulated knowledge about how the organization truly functioned beneath the surface. Who responded quickly when something broke? Which approvals actually mattered? Which timelines were realistic and which ones were aspirational? It was knowledge that rarely appeared in official documents, and yet it influenced almost every successful outcome. Sitting at my desk late one evening, flipping through those pages, I felt a quiet clarity settle in, not pride, not resentment, just understanding. The leverage I had been looking for wasn't power over people. It was perspective. I understood the system, and more importantly, I understood something about my own role within it. For years, I had been using that understanding to quietly stabilize everything around me, but nothing in my job description actually required me to do that. No contract, no explicit expectation, just habit, which meant I had another option. I could continue doing exactly what I had always done, or I could begin stepping back, carefully, thoughtfully, and allow the system to reveal how much it had been relying on invisible support. I closed the notebook slowly. The realization didn't feel triumphant. If anything, it felt almost clinical, like discovering a structural diagram hidden behind the walls of a building you had lived in for years. And once you've seen that diagram, one question inevitably appears. What happens if the structure changes? Understanding a system and deciding to change your role inside it are two very different things. For several days after that realization, I didn't do anything differently. I still attended meetings, I still responded to messages. From the outside, my behavior looked exactly the same. But internally, something had shifted. Because once you see the structure behind something, you can't go back to interacting with it blindly. You start noticing the moments where small interventions quietly keep everything functioning. A missing dataset that someone assumes will appear on its own. A meeting is scheduled before the necessary approvals have been completed. A deadline that technically exists only because no one has examined the dependencies underneath it. For years, my instinct had been automatic. Notice the issue, fix it before it becomes visible. But now, each time I spotted one of those moments, a small pause appeared in my thinking. Is this actually my responsibility? Not in the abstract sense, but in the practical sense. Is the system asking for my help? Or has it simply become accustomed to receiving it? That question surfaced the following Wednesday again during a cross-team planning meeting. Martin was presenting a revised timeline for another partnership rollout. The plan moved quickly from one milestone to the next, the way most strategic outlines do when they're still optimistic. Halfway through the presentation, he paused and looked toward me. "Keelan," he said, "you'll probably want to sanity check the operations side once we finalize this." The room nodded slightly. It was a familiar rhythm. Someone presents a plan, then I quietly translate it into something operationally possible. For a brief moment, I felt the old instinct rising. Open the notebook. Sketch the dependencies. Offer a calm correction. Instead, I simply nodded once. "Sure, Sal," I said. And then I waited. Martin continued explaining the rest of the timeline. No one asked additional questions about operational feasibility. No one paused to explore the details beneath the milestones. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Normally, that would have been the moment when I stayed behind or sent a follow-up message outlining the adjustments that would inevitably become necessary. This time, I closed my notebook. Not because I didn't see the issues. They were obvious. Legal review would push the second milestone by at least a week. The data integration step relied on a team that was already overloaded. And the marketing rollout assumed approvals that hadn't even been requested yet. I could see the entire chain of future complications. But instead of preemptively correcting them, I asked myself the same question again. Is it my responsibility to solve this before anyone else notices it? For the first time, the answer felt clear. No, not because I wanted the project to fail, and not because I felt resentful, but because the system had quietly trained itself to rely on invisible intervention. If I continued providing that intervention automatically, nothing would ever change. The realization felt surprisingly calm. Like stepping back from a machine you had been maintaining for years and watching how it operates without your hands inside it. That evening, I wrote something short in my notebook. A single sentence beneath the date. Observation without intervention. It wasn't a declaration, just a reminder. Because the decision point in stories like this rarely arrives as a dramatic turning moment. It arrives quietly, in the simple choice to stop solving problems that were never formally yours to solve. The phrase I wrote in my notebook, observation without intervention, wasn't a rule. It was more like an experiment. For years, I had been adjusting processes in real time, often before anyone else noticed the friction. Now I wanted to see what the system actually looked like when those adjustments didn't happen automatically. So the following week, I changed something very small. Not my work ethic, not my professionalism, just my boundaries. When tasks clearly belonged to my role, I handled them exactly as I always had. But when something drifted toward me simply because people assumed I would catch it, I paused. And sometimes I let it drift back. The first example appeared 2 days later. An email chain between 3 departments had grown long and slightly confused. Marketing was waiting on data that analytics thought had already been delivered. Analytics believed the request belonged to the product. The product assumed operations would coordinate the final data set. Normally, that kind of thread would eventually reach me. And when it did, I would summarize the issue, connect the right people, and quietly restore order. This time, the email arrived exactly as expected. Someone had added me to the chain with a short line. Keelan might be able to help untangle this. I read through the conversation carefully. Every piece of information needed to solve the problem was already there. The team simply hadn't connected the dots yet. In the past, I would have written a clear 2-paragraph response, explaining exactly what needed to happen next. Instead, I did something different. I asked a single question. Which team owns the final dataset delivery? Then I waited. The thread remained quiet for about 15 minutes. Then someone from the product responded. I think analytics does? Another message followed from analytics. We can provide it once marketing confirms the format. Finally, someone from marketing clarified what they needed. Within half an hour, the conversation had resolved itself. No intervention. Just a gentle nudge forcing the teams to look directly at the problem, instead of assuming someone else would fix it. That moment might seem insignificant, but something interesting began happening as the week continued. Without the invisible stabilizing layer I had always provided, small inefficiencies started becoming visible. Meetings ran slightly longer because people had to clarify details they normally would have skipped. Email threads required a few extra replies before reaching a solution. Occasionally, someone had to pause and say, "Wait, who's actually responsible for this?" None of it was catastrophic. The company didn't collapse. Projects didn't suddenly fail, but the rhythm changed. Work that once flowed smoothly now required a little more awareness from everyone involved. And slowly, very slowly, I noticed people beginning to adjust. Managers started asking more precise questions during meetings. Teams clarified responsibilities earlier in conversations. A few project timelines were rewritten with more realistic expectations, not because I forced those changes, but because the system could no longer rely on someone quietly correcting everything behind the scenes. The most interesting part, though, was something else entirely. No one accused me of doing less work. In fact, most people seemed to assume the changes they were noticing were simply part of the company growing and evolving, which meant the shift was happening exactly the way I wanted it to. Quietly, no confrontation, no speeches about fairness or recognition, just a gradual realignment of responsibility back toward the people who actually owned each part of the process. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. But internally, the system had begun rebalancing itself. And once a system starts revealing its true structure, the consequences don't appear all at once. They arrive gradually, one realization at a time. At first, the consequences were so subtle that no one described them that way. People simply started noticing that things required a little more effort than usual. A timeline that once moved quickly now paused while someone confirmed a dependency. A meeting that might have ended early stretched another 10 minutes because details had to be clarified in real time. None of it felt dramatic, but the rhythm of the work had shifted. One Monday morning, I saw the first clear example. Martin had scheduled another planning meeting for a partnership rollout. Normally, by the time a meeting like that happened, I would have already reviewed the background materials and quietly corrected anything that looked unrealistic. This time, I hadn't. When the meeting began, the presentation moved through its early slides smoothly. Objectives, strategic benefits, market positioning. Then Martin reached the timeline slide. A moment of silence followed. Someone from operations raised a hand. "Wait," she said gently. "Legal review usually takes longer than that." Martin glanced at the slide again. "Right," he said, "but we can probably accelerate it." Another voice joined in from the legal team. "We can try," he said carefully, "but we'd need the documentation earlier than what's listed here." For the next several minutes, the room worked through the timeline piece by piece, not arguing, just realizing. Milestone by milestone, the schedule stretched. 2 weeks became 3, 3 became almost 5. Watching the conversation unfold felt strangely familiar. It was the same correction I had quietly made dozens of times before. The only difference was that this time, the realization was happening inside the meeting, where everyone could see it. No one looked at me. No one asked why the issue hadn't been flagged earlier, because technically, it hadn't been my responsibility to flag it. When the meeting ended, Martin stayed behind for a moment while people packed their laptops. He turned slightly toward me. "Good catch from legal," he said. "Glad we caught that early." I nodded. "Yes," I replied. "It's better to see the dependencies up front." He didn't seem to notice the small shift in how the moment had unfolded, but I did, because the stabilizing work had still happened. It just hadn't been invisible anymore. And that pattern started repeating across other projects. In one case, a marketing launch had to move back a few days, because the analytics team hadn't been included early enough in the planning process. In another, an internal tool rollout required an extra coordination meeting because no one had clarified ownership of the testing phase. None of these outcomes were disasters. They were simply visible adjustments that previously would have happened quietly behind the scenes. What fascinated me most was how quickly people began adapting. Teams started double-checking assumptions earlier. Managers asked more detailed questions before committing to timelines. The system was learning, slowly but naturally, to distribute responsibility more evenly. But with that adjustment came another consequence, something less visible, but much more personal. The 3 managers who had once relied on my quiet coordination, Martin, Dana, and Lewis, began noticing that the flow of their projects felt slightly different. Not worse, just less frictionless. Dana mentioned it first during a short one-on-one check-in. "Things feel a little busier lately," she said thoughtfully. "More follow-ups than usual." Lewis phrased it differently a few days later. "I think some of the teams are still figuring out their handoffs," he said. "Processes might need tightening." Martin didn't comment directly, but I noticed he had begun scheduling longer planning sessions. More discussion, more verification. From the outside, it looked like the company was simply evolving its processes, which, in a way, it was. The invisible stabilizing layer had been removed, and now the structure underneath was becoming visible to everyone, not through confrontation, not through criticism, just through the natural consequences of a system operating without the quiet corrections it had once depended on. By the time people realized something was wrong, the damage had already taken shape in ways that couldn't be undone. It didn't happen with a loud announcement. There was no dramatic moment where someone slammed a hand on the table and demanded answers. Instead, it started with confusion. On Monday morning, the company's Slack channel was unusually quiet. Usually by 8:15 a.m., there would already be a dozen messages. Questions about deadlines, reminders about deliverables, someone tagging me about a spreadsheet or a report. That morning, there were only 3. At 8:47, Mark sent the first one. "Hey Keelan, quick question. Did the Q3 projection model get updated over the weekend?" No one responded, because for the first time in 3 years, the model wasn't there. The shared folder they all relied on still existed, of course. But the automated updates, the silent corrections, the small invisible adjustments that had always appeared before anyone noticed the problem, those were gone. At 9:10, Priya wrote another message. "Also, the vendor report is missing the reconciliation sheet. Was that moved somewhere?" Then another and another. By 9:30, the channel had shifted from routine to uneasy. Mark tried again. "Keelan? Rekit basa." I saw the message. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the notifications appear on my laptop like distant weather. For years, I would have answered within seconds. But that morning, I didn't open Slack, because 3 days earlier, something had quietly changed. The weekend meetings they had scheduled, those overlapping invitations that arrived all at once at 4:58 p.m. on Friday, had forced a decision none of them expected me to make. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just permanently. Over the past year, almost every critical system in our department had been tied, directly or indirectly, to processes I maintained. Not because I had demanded control, but because no one else had ever volunteered to learn them. They simply assumed I would always be there. The automation scripts, the vendor data reconciliation, the compliance documentation, the forecasting model that executives used in quarterly board meetings. All of it had slowly grown around my work like scaffolding. But over the previous month, I had quietly begun transferring those responsibilities out of my personal systems and into a documented handoff package. Step-by-step instructions, version histories, access permissions, clean, professional documentation. On Friday evening, after receiving those 3 simultaneous weekend meeting invites, I finalized something else, my resignation. It wasn't dramatic. No angry message, no confrontation, just a calm email scheduled to send at 8 a.m. Monday morning to HR and the executive director. 2 weeks' notice, a complete handover document is attached, and one short sentence at the end. Given recent expectations around availability and workload, I believe this is the appropriate time for me to transition out of the organization. Now, I didn't mention the meetings, I didn't accuse anyone. There was nothing emotional about it, which somehow made it harder for them to argue with. At 10:05 a.m., my phone buzzed. Mark was calling. I let it ring. A few minutes later, Priya called. Then HR, then the director. I didn't answer any of them right away. Not because I wanted them to panic, but because for the first time in years, my time actually belonged to me. By noon, the Slack channel had shifted from confusion to urgency. Does anyone know how to run the forecast manually? Where is the vendor audit template? Why aren't the scripts triggering? I watched the messages later that afternoon, not with satisfaction, just clarity. They weren't bad people. Most of them weren't even intentionally dismissive. But they had built an entire system around the assumption that one quiet person would always hold it together, without recognition, without boundaries, without asking how long that arrangement could last. By Tuesday morning, the director finally reached out to me through email. Subject line, "Can we talk about this?" The message itself was short. "Keelan, we didn't realize how much of the infrastructure you were maintaining until today. Several teams are struggling to access key workflows. Is there any way we can discuss alternatives before your resignation becomes final?" I read the email twice. There was no anger in it, only something close to concern, maybe even regret. But regret arrives late. That's the thing about quiet roles. People don't notice them while they're functioning. They only notice the silence after they're gone. And by the time the absence becomes clear, the decision that created it has usually already been made. I closed the email. Then I opened the handover document I had spent weeks preparing. Every process is explained. Every system is documented. Everything they needed to rebuild what I had quietly maintained for years. Nothing withheld. Nothing sabotaged. Just the truth, written carefully, because the point was never revenge. The point was simply this. When someone spends years being reliable, invisible, and endlessly available, people eventually begin to treat that reliability as permanent, until the day it isn't. And by the time they finally understand what was holding everything together, it's already too late to fix the assumption that broke it. The meeting happened on Wednesday morning. Daniel, our director, appeared on the screen first. Mark and Priya joined a few seconds later. For a moment, no one spoke. That alone felt unusual. For years, I had been the quiet one in meetings, the person who listened while everyone else filled the space with explanations. Now the silence belonged to them. Daniel cleared his throat. "Keelan, thank you for joining. We reviewed the documentation you sent." He paused. "And honestly, we didn't realize how much infrastructure you were maintaining." Mark rubbed his forehead. Priya avoided the camera. Daniel continued carefully. "A lot of our workflows depended on systems you built or maintained. We're trying to piece them together now." I nodded. "The handover document should cover most of it." "It does," Priya said quickly, "but some of the logic behind those systems isn't always obvious." That was true. Systems grow through hundreds of small decisions. The steps can be written down, but the reasoning behind them takes time to understand. Daniel leaned forward. "I'm going to ask directly. Would you consider staying a little longer, maybe a few months, just to help with the transition?" The question hung in the air. 3 years ago, I probably would have said yes immediately. Back then, loyalty meant staying, helping, fixing things. But Friday had changed something, not emotionally, just clearly. "I appreciate the offer," I said calmly, "but I've already accepted another opportunity." Mark looked up. "So, you're definitely leaving?" "Yes." There was no anger in the room, just quiet acceptance. Daniel nodded slowly. "Well, I won't try to convince you again, but I want to say this." He paused. "You did exceptional work here. We just didn't understand how much of it was yours." I gave a small smile. Most systems look simple when they're working. The call ended 15 minutes later. No arguments, no accusations, just the quiet recognition of something they had only noticed once it was already gone. 2 weeks later, I packed the last few things from my desk: a notebook, a mug with a small crack in the handle, and my fountain pen. That was all. The office was almost empty when I left. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hallway. For 3 years, I had spent most of my time here, quietly building systems that kept everything running. Not glamorous work, just be careful at work. When I stepped outside the building, something felt different. Not triumphant, just lighter. My new role at the consulting firm started the following Monday. On my second day, someone asked me a question I had never heard before. What part of operational design do you enjoy the most? It took me a moment to answer. Because in my previous job, no one had asked what I enjoyed. They only asked what needed fixing. But here, the systems themselves were the work. People didn't expect me to quietly repair problems. They asked me to design better structures from the beginning. During one meeting that week, I explained a flaw in a client's reporting process and suggested a redesign. No one interrupted. One of the senior consultants nodded. That's a strong approach. Let's explore that. It was a small moment, but it showed me something important. The quiet version of myself had never been the problem. I had simply been in the wrong environment. Now the same habits, observing, thinking carefully, speaking only when necessary, were seen as strengths, and for the first time, my work wasn't invisible. It was simply understood. There's something strange about quiet work. While it's happening, most people don't notice it. They just assume everything is functioning the way it's supposed to. Deadlines get met, reports appear on time, systems run smoothly, and no one asks who's keeping it that way until the day it stops. When I left, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no arguments, just a few systems that stopped running automatically. And suddenly, people began to see how much structure had been quietly holding everything together. But I don't regret those years. They taught me how organizations really work. And they taught me something more important about boundaries. Reliability should never require invisibility. If people assume you will always carry the weight, they eventually stop noticing that you're carrying it at all. Sometimes the strongest decision isn't confrontation. Sometimes it's simply stepping away, letting silence reveal what words never needed to say. So I'm curious about something. If you've ever been the person quietly holding everything together, did people recognize your value while you were still there, or only after you left?